Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time out of a busy morning to join us for this usual Tuesday coffee chat from America's Market Intelligence on mining issues. I'm actually very proud to have a good old friend today joining us. Hi, Nicholas, if you want to just say hi to everyone and maybe introduce yourself, and then I'll explain the topics of conversation from today, which I think are very relevant to a lot of people part of this call today. Please, Nicholas.
Hi, yeah, thanks a lot, first of all, for inviting me. I like your initiative. It's like a geeky version of comedians in cars getting coffee. You know that series by Jerry Seinfeld?
Yes.
Just that you're not picking me up in a fancy car, which yeah, I think you should consider that for the next series.
Definitely I will, I promise.
But yeah, so I'm Nick Maennling. I'm working currently in Santiago de Chile for GIZ, for the German Development Corporation, on a regional program that essentially tries to promote sustainability in the mining sector. And prior to my life here, so I've been here since January, and as you can imagine, I had a little bit different expectation of my arrival here, but I guess that's a worldwide phenomenon. Rather than knowing the city and the country a little bit better, I've known very well the inside of my house because the lockdown has been now, I think we're in our 10th week or 11th week.
But I mean, Nicholas, we've been through this and ups and downs, you and I. I mean, I've known you for a little while. We were supposed to see COP 18 in Santiago, not COP 18, COP in Santiago in December, which got cancelled. So that was the first change of track for you also, I assume, working on mining and renewable energy and mining and climate change. And then, COVID-19 is basically just a follow-up of the last 6 months for you, right? I mean, it's been a wild ride from moving away from Columbia University, which was a very good and interesting engagement that you had, to now, going to Santiago. So it's been a bumpy ride for you, right?
Yeah, it has been challenging, but I think, I mean, in the end of the day, the challenges that other people are going through are much harder than mine, so I shouldn't complain.
I think that's the spirit. Let me just, I mean, we have to do this every single time. I know it's a little bit, administrative to have to do this, but I want to share here a disclaimer that we have, which is the opinions expressed by today's panelists is their personal views and may not reflect the views of the organization that they represent. Whenever possible, AMI has verified the accuracy of the information provided by the third parties, but does not, under any circumstances, accept responsibility for any inaccuracies should they remain unverified. It is expected that webinar attendees will use the information provided in this webinar in conjunction with other information and with sound management practices. AMI, therefore, will not assume responsibility for commercial loss due to business decision made based on the use or non-use of the information provided in today's webinar. So this is not the part that I enjoy the most, having to mention this. But basically, now that we're done with this, I just wanted to just reinforce what we're going to try to talk about during this coffee chat. Nicholas and I have been working on the mining dimension and sector for a little while, whether it's about trying to integrate the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and mainstream them into mining operations, into the designing of mining company strategies in Latin America specifically, but also under other geographies and in other jurisdictions. And then since Nicholas has joined GIZ, he's been working more specifically on governance and local content. So those are a bit the issues that we're going to be covering today, and ways is to try to make it as interactive as possible. And therefore, if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to read the chat and bring them up to the attention of Nicholas so that he can actually provide some deeper analysis or answer directly to the question of one of our member of our distinguished mining audience and investors audience at this coffee chat. So maybe I'll just turn to you with the first question, Nicholas. Both you and I have been working on trying to design processes or best practices for development of local content for mining companies. It's essential, obviously, for mining companies to gain their social license to operate, to be accepted and integrated within community. That community sense that they are a partner of vision for the territory, that they are involved through local content. Can you maybe just very as introductory remarks, explain, how the debates around local content has evolved over the last, years or months, and how you are personally engaged into this and trying to implement some of those design and strategy that we've talked about, several times, usually around a bottle of wine rather than on Zoom, but that's also a good way to do it this morning.
Right. Sure. So yeah, I mean, especially during my time at CCSI, we did quite a bit of work on local content, and particularly in Africa. Over the last years, there has been quite a surge in local content regulations, where governments are saying, okay, if you come and invest here, you need local content regulations. What we found most generally is that the local content in a country is not so determined whether you have hard legislation or soft support programs. So you have countries like Chile, where we are now, that don't have very strict local content rules, but have more of an approach of working together with government to develop local content, where, people say, and you see it in the economy as well, it has worked relatively successfully. And then other countries that have very strict norms, but they are too tough and are not implemented, or then there are no fines to basically enforce them. So there is no necessarily a correlation between the strictness of your local content rules and whether it works or not. What we found mostly to be the case is that those countries that have good support mechanisms in place, like supporting small and medium-sized enterprises, working together with companies to trying to see how to break up contracts in order to make sure that that local business can actually supply whatever you need, because oftentimes they're very big contracts, and especially for jurisdictions that don't have a long mining history, it's very tough to apply to those tenders. And even very simple things like the language. I mean, in some jurisdictions, an English tender just doesn't work. So working together between companies and governments and local governments as well, and mining associations, a collaborative approach is pretty much the most important component in order to make sure that that local content works.
So when usually you have stakeholders of mining companies that mention local content, they can actually mention a whole different range of issues, whether you're talking about local hiring, for example, which is not the heart of local content, to having contract with companies that either provide food or the catering or the trucking or the logistics, to also trying to have a larger approach with the municipalities or the regional entities in terms of trying to design strategies of including other local economic actors in the design or the development or commercialization of products from the mine. How do you actually address some of those issues, and how do you conceptualize it yourself at GIZ, and where do you think that you are most effective, or where mining companies can do a better job or better understand the positive output of stepping up the local content strategies?
Right. So I think what you're saying, or what you're asking, is a very important question, because I think especially in the local content space, things are moving relatively fast, and now COVID might exacerbate the speed at which mining companies will seek to automate and digitalize processes, also because right now you don't want people agglomerating in small spaces, right? So I think the current sanitary crisis probably will accelerate the trend to automation and digitalization. And there, obviously, the question becomes, what can you procure locally and what can you not procure locally? Most probably in regions where, particularly in the past, you could get very basic procurement, like food, like clothing, things related to people that work in the mine. Those are likely to fall away because of automation if you have less people in the mine site. So how do you then create a new shared value approach if the people in the region where you're mining don't benefit anymore from jobs? I think this is a very critical question that we're also seeking to analyze a bit more now in our project here with GIZ, to see, you know, what are other alternatives for mining projects to integrate themselves into a region and benefit the region. I think that we will have to go beyond the strict thinking of local content, but also look at other potential linkages to the mining sector, like, for example, shared use infrastructure, or thinking through how the agriculture sector can work or benefit from, let's say, water infrastructure investments by mining companies. So I think in the future, you know, local content is still going to be very important, and it's going to change in terms of what the skills will be needed and how you will approach local actors to benefit from mining through direct jobs. But also, as you say, that indirect impacts, I think, will have to be broader and maybe move away a little bit from the traditional thinking of, okay, how can we make sure that people benefit specifically from mining, but how can the mining project benefit other activities that may not necessarily then serve as an input back into the mining operations?
Yeah, I do understand that. Actually, you raise a very interesting issue, which is the impact of automation on indeed the way that mining companies are integrated inside the area of influence of the operation. We've done, you know, on the series of those coffee chats, we mentioned different ways of approaching mining communities, engaging other economic stakeholders through local content, through microcredit, through a different series of different protocol. But what you're saying, which is extremely important, is that indeed a series of mining companies have moved towards automation for a series of good reasons, whether it's economic reasons, whether it's you know, being able, on some cases, to free themselves maybe from a large union that might be criminalized. I think about very specific operations where we've been you know, integrated and trying to advise the mining company. But if you do this, indeed, the capacity of having a footprint of comprehensive development from the mining company is more limited, because you have less interaction with workers, you have less interaction with communities. How do you see maybe the automation aspect of it also being another vector for, you know, development of the territory through the sharing of technology, through the sharing of best practices of maintenance, maybe on some equipment? Obviously, this probably targets a very specific aspects of some of the mines in more advanced jurisdiction, less so if you're in Amapá or Maranhão in the Amazon forest in Brazil. But do you still think that this opens the gates for additional interaction and creation of local companies around the mining site? Or do you think that actually will potentially be a step back towards engaging with the communities?
Well, I think the way, I mean, especially here in the region, there has been a lot of conflict around mining, right? And I don't see that changing anytime soon. And because of the automation issue, if you don't address the community and the social issues, I think that may intensify. So if you just automate processes and don't consider how that will impact where you operate, I think you'll have an even bigger problem in terms of the social acceptance of mining projects going forward. So I think the approach will have to be a little bit different from the past. So just to be clear, by no means would I advocate that mines shouldn't automate, because I do think there are a lot of positive aspects to it. I mean, you mentioned economy, I think safety, also the environmental impact through a lot of technologies can improve. I think what we're trying to assess a little bit also with the study that we're doing is how to address the social component. And maybe there are new technologies that can also help to improve the communications and the interactions that you have with the community. So thinking of complaint mechanisms, thinking of different ways of, you know, how technology potentially can also help improve the territory where you're operating. So I think that component of the coin maybe hasn't been looked at into too much detail, and that's what we're trying trying to do. And I think that goes back to your question of, you know, how do you go about operating in areas where it's been difficult in the past, and that may be exacerbated due to automation, where, you know, direct jobs will fall away. And most often when you go into regions, when you ask people, what do you want? They say, I want a job. That's number one, right?
And if I a follow-up question, and I'm still very much interested in addressing local content before we move over maybe on issues of governance and others.
Sure.
Without mentioning automation, I know you've been working, and we've been you also on trying to design approach with communities, development of opportunities for local content. We mentioned them already, okay? But
right.
My question is much more on how do you maintain steadily relationship with those groups, families, sometimes individuals, sometimes that can actually be the one cooking, or larger companies that are economic actors for large, you know, industrial companies. How do you maintain the relationship with them and maybe engage deeper and deeper into an integration? Is there a specific process or protocol that, you know, GIZ has worked on, or would you have any kind of advice for people that deal with communities and understand that it's not only about signing a contract on, let's say, logistics or on providing food or on maintenance? It's also really about, you know, setting alliances and building relationship of trust, and use those as a vector for relation with the overall communities. Is there a specific case study that you've been analyzing that actually is an example, for example?
Yeah, so what we've always been advocating for is a longer term planning process, whereby companies come in, you know, have the community consultations, look a little bit beyond the impacts that the mine may have, but discuss longer term development issues. And this is very much related to, you know, the work that we did on integrating the SDGs in mining processes and how to go about that. And we did several projects on that topic here in Chile and also elsewhere, trying to work with mining companies and local actors to see, okay, if a large scale investment comes in, what does it mean in terms of long-term impacts, and what do we want as a community and as a local government? So oftentimes the local governments have, depending on obviously on where you are, they have you know, capacity constraints, financial constraints to develop long-term strategies and to implement them and to monitoring them. So I think one of the key aspects of the SDG framework is that it has specific indicators that have been agreed to by everyone around the world, pretty much, that this is how we measure development. And so what we've been advocating in these projects is to start the conversation with the communities and the local actors to say, where do you see yourself in 20 years? What are your objectives? Completely separate from the mining project. So that could be health, that could be education, that could be, you know, looking pretty much at the SDG framework, and then saying, okay, how do we set up a system whereby we see where you are right now and where you want to be and how you're going to achieve that, and then think through how the mining project fits into that and where it can support. And I think that's a very strong way to also see how the mining project can then support very specific objectives that have been identified in these meetings, and then monitor them over time through the indicators. Now, one issue that is very pertinent in most mining jurisdictions is that a lot of the data is not being collected at the local level, so it's very hard to monitor. And I think this is, again, where the technology aspect comes in, because nowadays we can collect data at a much, much lower cost than we could maybe 30 or 40 years ago, where everything went through census and maybe surveys, which were very expensive. Today we have the technology to collect a lot of data at a very low cost, which I think can help in this process.
Very true, and I think you, I don't know if you were listening to a series of the best coffee chats, but I mean, obviously for us, we keep mentioning the importance of having data and obviously understanding best practices, but applying them to the specificity of the mine project itself and the specificity of the stakeholders. There was a question from Germán Ibanez asking how are you able to identify the group leaders, for example, among communities? I mean, I can start to address this, and then maybe you can follow up on this, Nicholas. For us, it's all about building relationship with communities. We're an intelligence company, not intelligence as in Edward Snowden and NSA and all this, but really just trying to make sense of what are the reasons behind certain amounts of concerns or a series of demands that in most actually legitimate, others might be influenced by criminal actors. But when you actually try to identify group leaders, they actually usually come up by themselves in the sense that they have a legitimacy among the community. There's important elements of doing a background check, usually on those community leaders, obviously, in case they have actually been, tainted by, other organizations that might not be formal or other examples such as this. But usually finding the group leaders is not the complex part. Gaining the trust of the communities through the group leaders and through a series of different actors inside the communities is what takes a lot of time, not so much money, but a lot of time, and being able to deliver on your word on a regular basis, and then understand where you have communities of interests between those communities and the mining companies to see what are they looking for. Are they looking for additional social infrastructure? Are they looking for jobs? As Nicholas was mentioning, obviously usually the first step, but also what is their vision, and then understanding what should be the future of the territory on which they live, sometimes for generations. And so usually it's not that complex to find the group leaders. It's much more complex to actually be able to articulate the aspiration of the group leaders, representative of the communities, and the bridge between the mining interests and those aspirations to make sure that there is an element of development for the territory. And I'm just liaising to Nicholas, kind of doing a transition maybe for his follow-up answer on this. The work done on the ODS, the Sustainable Development Goals, so the Spanish just came in, the Sustainable Development Goals, and mapping them to the mining sector is essential to try to see, when you come back to the really basis of what define development, mining companies can integrate with communities and through those group leaders to move forward on the lines of those different SDGs. I don't know if that answers your question, Germán. Please continue with a follow-up question afterwards. But Nicholas, do you want to add up to this? And then I'll turn probably more towards the role of government and governance in territories.
Sure. So my background is more on the macroeconomic and on the planning side. So most of the time we let the identification of the stakeholders to guys like you. I think
you're the brain of the operation, and I'm
no, I didn't. But I think one aspect that through GIZ we're also trying to advocate for is to make sure that maybe some of the groups that may be minorities and may not necessarily speak up to a leader of a community, because a community is not a single entity. There are also a lot of interests and power structures in there. So to try and ensure that these stakeholders meetings take a very holistic view, I think it's very important to take a lot of time and to speak to a lot of people in these consultations, because oftentimes, even when you identify maybe group leaders, you run the risk at not getting a representative sample of who the community is and what they want. So I think that's one very important aspect that we always advocate for when doing these consultations. I think one thing that you mentioned is also key, that you need to adapt the indicators. So we spoke about the SDG indicators and their set of indicators, but they may not necessarily reflect the specificities of the mine site. So it's absolutely key to use, I think, the SDG framework as a framework, but then to adapt the indicators that you want to measure, collect, and monitor to the specificities of what is demanded and what the site represents. So if, for example, you're looking at a mine site that is operating in a very arid region where water is an issue, you may want to choose 3 to 4 water indicators. You can look at the SDG indicators, whether any of them are useful for your purpose. If they are, then I would go with them, because a lot of experts worked, I think, 5 years to select some of these. So they're kind of pre-vetted, if you like. But you may also decide, okay, you know, there's a very specific issue here that is not covered by those indicators, so we're going to create a new one. So I think it's very important to adapt the framework and look at the data that you will collect according to the specificities of the mine site, as you mentioned.
No, and I think, again, we're going back to, and that's because you're the macro analyst and the big brain here. We're going back to the data and how you actually, you know, understand and design strategies and policies based on the data. One of the issues that indeed, you know, GIZ is facing, sometimes we're facing, is that a lot of the mining operations are in very remote areas, which is, to be very honest, also a good thing to show that the mining sector is probably the only one that can provide development in some of those very, you know, remote areas and prevent, you know, the rural exodus back to the cities, and actually trying to find a full development, sustainable development, far away from the big centers of Santiago de Chile, Medellin, Bogota, Lima, or others, but trying to really, you know, develop projects here. The problem that you have, just switching towards the absence of presence of government, sometimes the traditional and legitimate actors, usually to be interactive with populations, obviously the elected government, with a series of issues that you have sometimes with a regional governor opposing a national state level and others. But in some areas, the presence of the state is very limited because of arid region, because of the absence, and there's limited schools, there's limited hospital, there's limited presence. The governance of, you know, how operations and decisions are taken at the municipality level are sometimes a little less, you know, set par compared to, you know, some areas where there's more scrutiny, let's put it this way. How do you, and I know GIZ actually has worked a lot on governance in the mining territory. How do you define and how do you actually conceptualize the levels of governance, and how do you advise, you know, either governmental actors or local actors to improve the governance in the mining sector, in the mining territory today?
Right. Good question. Well, first of all, I think, you know, it's important to understand, or I think it's absolutely crucial to make sure that you don't take over the role as a government, as a mining company. Because ultimately the mining project is going to finish, and then if you take over the role of the government, then the community is going to be left afterwards with nothing, right? Absolutely. So in jurisdictions where you have a very strong local government, the mining company can take the role of, you know, the private actor that does its business, contributes to society, and makes sure it doesn't break the law. I think in areas where governance is very low and capacity is very low, the responsibility becomes much greater to work with all the local stakeholders, including the government, and build up that capacity. And this process that I mentioned to you through the 2 projects that we did of developing a long-term development plan, building up monitoring systems, I think that is all part of also building the capacity of the government. So it's important to not take it over, but to support the local government in doing that. This is not always easy, particularly because election cycles are normally shorter than mining projects, right? So you may have one mayor who supports mining and the next one doesn't. But I think that makes this long-term component and the long-term plan, where essentially through your consultation, everyone has signed up and said, yeah, this is what we want. You know, in 30 years time, we want my kids going to school, and we want education levels to be higher, and health indicators to be higher. And even if the next mayor says, look, I don't want mining is not my thing, you can still say, look, this is what we committed to. Okay, it was a previous government, but you know, all the people that essentially also elected you also wanted this, and we can show it. And so I think it's one way to try and work over election cycles, which I know in many jurisdictions is very, very complicated, because unfortunately the sector is very politicized.
No, absolutely. And there was an interesting comment made on the chat, which I'm going to read. It's made privately. It was meant to be for the audience. I mean, all communities wish for some benefit from the extraction of the minerals in the area. The biggest problem I see is the governments do not manage the tax income fairly. And that's very true. There's an issue of royalties, of disbursements of royalties, a series of reforms that sometimes has been at the expense of the mining territory and mining municipalities. Therefore, kind of antagonizing communities even more against mining. Technology is, finish the comment, technology is key to all mining companies being successful, but making sure the community is protected by the government is almost impossible to control. I think here, the main question is to see how do you work with governmental entities and organizations where their presence in the outreach is limited. It's not, I mean, no mining company wants to take the price of the government. It's not their job. I mean, a lot of mining companies do not want to develop too much CSR, and because the job of mining companies is to mine, is to develop minerals and to process it. But how do you then operate when there's a lack of liaison through governmental entities, or those can actually be, subpar in terms of corruptive practices or in terms of our representativity? How do you engage, therefore, with the communities without taking the place of the government, as you were mentioning?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I would argue is that if you look in a lot of very remote regions in developed countries like Australia, like Norway, you will see that a lot of the towns were actually originally built by mining companies. So if you go far up north, they built schools, they built hospitals. So in a way, but now obviously they've been taken over by local governments, the management of these. But if you look at the origins of some of these places, it's not that different from, let's say, if you go into the depths of Africa or into really rural areas of Latin America. I think also in advanced economies, you see where in the past the mining sector has very heavily invested in social infrastructure that some would argue is the role of the government. Sorry, I think you're muted. Or my audio is not working anymore.
I'm a rookie. I don't know how to manage those Zoom chats anymore. But going back to just to complete on the point that you were making before you jump on another one, I think what's interesting indeed is you're looking at how mining companies can impact the territory, can make some changes. That the fact that some cities were built out of mining, and that's very true. And in the first world, that's also very much the case in many cities in Brazil, in Chile, in Peru, in Colombia. But I guess because all those achievements are there, they sometimes, if I may, poorly communicate to communities, or the engagement or the vision from the perspective from communities. And I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying it's important to acknowledge that so that it's possible to correct it later. Is that they're seen as exogenous. It's coming from outside. Let's say you're from Medellin, it's coming from Bogota. You're from, let's say, a place in Arequipa, in Moquegua, in south of Peru, and it's the company coming from Lima. It's seen as outside, sometimes perceived as arrogant, and sometimes perceived as, through different speeches, discourse that is from mining companies saying, we're arriving with the salaries, we're going to save you from poverty. We're going to, bring you to development. It sometimes, antagonizes the population there that feels that, they're not treated, correctly based on their history, on their tradition. They're saying, we're not here for sale. We're not here. And they do not see that element of social infrastructure that is being built by the mining company.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of work to be done here. Not only, it's not a question of PR communication, making another, how many ads and communication we've seen in the mining sector that actually didn't have, a real impact on the ground, but it's much more into the addressing of the communities themselves, the time spent to explain this and to showcase and make it known the evolution and the improvement of the territory thanks to the mining company, not only on money, but also on those infrastructure. Do you have some cases that maybe can fit in that angle, or we can just move to your second point? I cut you in the middle of your sentence almost earlier.
No. I think that's fine. I mean, we've done a lot of work on shared use infrastructure while still at CCSI, trying to look at where infrastructure investments by mining companies have contributed not only that particular project, but either unlocked other mining projects or served, you know, other sectors. In Peru, there is an interesting example of the Cerro Verde mine where in order to get its water license for the expansion, they developed a water treatment plant for Arequipa, thereby improving, you know, the water quality of the city, and at the same time obtaining its water license. So approaches like those, I think, are innovative, that benefit the region very directly, and, you know, sometimes can have a lower risk than through the channel of payment of royalties and the mismanagement of those, or other forms of taxes. I'm not saying that they shouldn't pay taxes or shouldn't pay royalties. I'm just saying that, you know, this is one example of how you could go into a territory based very specifically on the specificities of Arequipa, right? What is needed, and the problems there, to come up with creative solutions of how to integrate yourself in a territory and try and create benefits both to the local population and to make sure that you can operate, because without that investment, they probably wouldn't have received the water license. We are now analyzing, or the last project that I was involved with at CCSI was looking at the Karajas corridor in Brazil. And, you know, there you have on the railway passenger services and transport of other general cargo, apart from the iron ore. And, you know, I mean, there have been loads of impacts as a result of that project because it's so massive. Both positive and negative, but I think that example of the shared use passenger services, for example, that are cheaper than if you take a bus or a flight from one end to the other end of the corridor, that's another creative solution of trying to support the region where you're operating in.
Another example of supporting the region where you're operating, I remember one of our virtual conversations was about, you know, the use of renewable energy and solar panels to both power a mining site, but also potentially, you know, branch out to communities outside. So basically using the powering of the mine as a goodwill movement towards the communities of bringing them power. I mean, you actually can even have on some of those lines, you know, some small cells for Wi-Fi, for internet and others. Can you actually give us example of some of those projects? I know you've been working on this. I know that the price of energy right now probably doesn't make it as fancy and attractive that it did probably in 2014 or even 2 years ago. But can you actually show how, you know, the impact that it had on the communities of creating well-being, social well-being, of transmitting energy thanks to the mining site, and therefore, as a result, building some support from the community to the mining operation?
Right. Yeah. To give you some background, so we did this work on shared use energy infrastructure, which was a study together with the World Bank that was energy agnostic, and then with a view specifically on, you know, providing energy in rural areas where there is no electrification. So how mining projects can help electrify areas that don't necessarily have access to energy. And then the follow-up study was looking specifically at renewables. And I think here it's very important to also distinguish a little bit a trend, and this is also for my project at GIZ particularly interesting, because the renewable aspect, you know, one is the price, but the other is, I think there is increasing demand from the consumer industry to say, okay, let's decarbonize the mining operations, right? And one of the ways to do that is to integrate renewable power. And I'm saying that that's very relevant for our project at GIZ, because, you know, our car industry in Germany is seeing a massive transition to electric vehicles. And so one of our project components is to look at increasing social and economic transparency and standards in the lithium and copper value chains, which are absolutely key for battery vehicles, right? So the argument going like, okay, if we're now trying to solve the climate crisis, we need to make sure that where the stuff is produced, we're not violating human rights, and we're not contaminating the environment. I'm saying this because I think you have, and we've primarily been speaking now to the local component of sustainability and how to support the populations and the communities that you're operating in. And then you have this global perspective of sustainability that I think is coming with a lot of force, is new, and everyone is kind of trying to figure out how fast this will go. And I mean, you see it particularly in the oil and gas sector, which has come under severe pressure on this front. But I think the next sector is the mining sector. And I think companies are starting to position themselves in terms of offering. I mean, you already have low carbon aluminium products that are available. And you may see that in copper and other products too. So yeah, that's, I think, a very interesting development.
One of those developments, just to follow up on what you were saying, we had content. I was in Indaba in Cape Town, South Africa at the time, another time when we could actually travel the world. And so there was a series of different panels and conversation with car manufacturers, with whether you were talking about whether German car manufacturers, some French ones also were involved into this. Some battery producers and cell phone producers were there. I mean, Samsung, for example, Daewoo was very much involved into it in trying to look down in terms of the transparency of supply chain and impacting, understanding the above the ground risk and the potential negative impact on some of those operations. And on the other side, for the operation that don't have a very limited, negative impact compared to some others, certifications levels and series of processes. This is really something that we've seen both you and I, change over the last 2-3 years with real new protocols. I probably will do a specific coffee chat on this. That might be interesting. I'd like just to move to the question that was made by Anna Pobolezna. She was apparently very interesting by your discussion on shared water infra between mining companies and the communities of the region. Can you give example of how water, which is especially in Latin America, we're seeing in Ecuador, in Peru, in Colombia, in Atacama, and Argentina, a real demand for preservation of water impact and the impact of mining resources. Can you give more details of how the shared water infrastructure was successful in the example that you were mentioning?
Yeah, so the Cerro Verde example, I mean, you can actually look up the case study itself. There is quite a bit of documentation behind it. But essentially, the mining company was looking to expand. There is very little water. So they had to come up with a creative solution of making sure that no fresh water was taken for the operation, and then came up with the idea of using basically or processing the wastewater of Arequipa in order to use some of it for the mining operations, which created a, if you like, win-win situation. I think there is another example in Namibia where desalination plant was built at excess capacity, where the plant, I mean, the economics for the plant were made viable by the mining project, but then an excess was built in to provide water to the communities. That project, I think the mining project never went ahead ultimately. So the desalination plant exists. The mining project never went ahead because of the uranium prices crashing afterwards. But I think this concept may also be very relevant in regions like here in Chile, where, as you know, mining companies or future operations will have to build desalination plants if they want to operate. So here again, the question is, as a government, how do I make sure that not only the mining and also the mining company's perspective. How can I make sure that if I operate up in a valley, I'm the only one with the water? I will have social issues. So those concepts of shared use water, I think, will be absolutely key to make sure that as an operation, I receive the social license to operate, and to create shared value in other ways than, you know, coming back to the beginning of our conversation, than local procurement, which may be on the downside given the automation trend.
But you see, what you're mentioning here, I think that's very interesting, because I mean, when we talk about local content, first of all, it's a wide range of issues, obviously. And then, as I was mentioning, you need to implement it very specifically depending on the situation of the mining site. It's not the same thing if it's a mature mining jurisdiction or if it's not, if it's in remote area or closer to urban centers. But yet, there's probably one tendency, that trend that actually is often confirmed, where you can actually, you know, make a better case for your local content, but actually have much more return for your bucks. Let's put in financial perspective. It's not only to focus on the national level, like, you know, talking with government for their license to operate and regulation and others. It's not only in terms of, you know, talking with communities, which is very important. We had a serious question on this, of finding the leaders, of understanding, you know, through surveys, through socialization initiative, public hearings. Although right now it's complicated, but there's different ways to get the information from communities. It is sometimes the biggest, you know, game changer is at the regional level. It's about understanding who are the large infrastructure actors or local economic actors or others where you could actually sign alliances. You were mentioning that desalinization plant that was made, you know, economically viable thanks to the mining project, although afterwards with unit prices actually changed in terms of the capacity to move forward with the mine. But we see regularly on different operations we operate, we see a lack of interaction with local governors, because there's a tendency from mining companies to believe that most of the things are anyway done at the environmental entities at the national level or with the Minister of Mines or others. Well, there's a lot of things that can be done with the provincial level political actors, but even more, understanding when you're looking at, let's say, water companies, energy companies, large potential, you know, providers of jobs sometimes, or, you know, other, you know, traditional actors, understanding who is ready to invest also in that very specific region or that, you know, in the vicinity of your mining operation. And therefore, it would make sense to limit your exposure financially to different social infrastructure or hard infrastructure and bundle with them with the purpose of serving the larger communities. And sometimes, you know, when you can't be on the ground, the other actor can be on the ground and so on, so that, you know, you can continue communicating and showing that you're present and you're working not only obviously for the mining, you know, project, because that's why you're there, but you see it with the comprehensive vision of how you can actually help develop the territory. So that was a long monologue again. But the idea here is that at this regional level is often where you see the difference that can be made. I don't know if GIZ actually, when you work on projects, you work with mining companies, you also work with, you know, obviously states, because you're a state entity, but do you have a drilling down to the regional level with provinces, for example, departments and others, or do you actually, how do you work with mining companies on that level?
Right, yeah, so we're at GIZ, we're trying to pilot things and see if it works, you know? So one thing that we're doing right now, or looking to do in Peru, is to take one of these international standards that primarily serve to, let's say, assure the buyer of the commodity and the investors that the operations are doing a good job. But oftentimes the audits and the information that comes out of these reports, let's say, is not brought back down to the local level. So what we're trying to pilot now is to look in a specific region, okay, what sort of information comes out of that? What are the demands on the ground? And can we learn anything from that data that can retro-element, you know, the initiatives that exist on the ground? Because often you have initiatives of sustainability on the ground, and oftentimes you have it, particularly now in Europe. Europe is very interested in creating initiatives and standards and audits that make sure that the minerals are sourced in a socially, economically, and ecologically responsible manner. So yeah, we primarily pilot. We want to pilot stuff, and we and that's what we're doing in the 5 countries we operate in. So our portfolio includes Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, Peru, and Bolivia. It's like the Andean region. One important point that you mentioned in terms of looking at actors that are investing in the region, which I completely agree with, is fiber optics cable. This is one area where I think there's a huge opportunity for mining companies to collaborate with telecommunications companies. And we've often seen that doesn't necessarily have to come at an additional cost, because oftentimes the telecommunications companies are, you know, the biggest cost of laying down fiber optics cables is basically laying out the cable. So if you can combine that with, you know, infrastructure costs for a slurry pipeline or a railway or a power infrastructure, you can reduce your cost by up to 80%. So there is a real business case of working together with the telecommunication company, where both businesses, you know, benefit, and you're creating a social infrastructure that is absolutely key and will increase to be important. I mean, I think, you know, telecommunications and fiber optic cable and access to internet is so key nowadays, will be more important in the future. So that's one area where I think there are lots of opportunities that sometimes are overlooked because you don't look at who's investing in what when. So it's just a matter of coordination.
No, absolutely. And telecommunication is a very interesting sector, because if you're looking at it from the angle of being able to communicate how you positively impact a territory, bundling and partnering with a telecommunication company, that seems obvious, but you know, I started my career in the telecommunication sector in the cell phone business in Africa and Latin America, the first 3 or 4 years of my career. And you see that most of the usage of remote population is through cell phone. So if you have a partnership, let's say with Telefonica, with Claro, with MTN in Africa, then there's also ways then to communicate through MTN, through Claro and Telefonica that have such wide outreach to their, you know, clients, of saying that, you know, this was actually brought also together thanks to a partnership with the mining company. The same thing we see, I mean, my practice is also on infrastructure energy, for example, and energy, we know of energy companies right now that are ready to invest several $100 million into a large solar panel projects, as long as they have the strong mining company on the side as an off-taker to give them a PPP on 8 to 10 years, and then they can actually reach out. But my point is, there's a series of different actors that are looking at the same problems, which is the problem of social license to operate, which are looking at, you know, developing infrastructure and developing both, you know, energy, mining, telecommunication infrastructure, energy and telecommunication infrastructure, using the backup of the mining companies as a partner for, you know, that large operation to serve as an off-taker. And if those, you know, synergies were clearly, you know, outlined, and we can help, you can help, and we know, I mean, we do have some partners that are ready to move forward on this, then that would really reduce costs for the mining companies. That will also allow them to have a much better outreach to that positive contribution to the mining territory, either through, as I said, telecommunication or energy, but also more generic, you know, local content on other smaller operations. The same mentality. It's about time. It's about communication with communities, understanding them, and then partnering to share the costs and the responsibility for bringing change to the territory.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No. Absolutely. On the renewable side, you know, we did this global study with CCSI a year or two ago that looks a little bit at the renewable power opportunities and at the bottlenecks. And right now with GIZ, we're also funding a study to look at the opportunities in Peru. And we'll also do a short study in Colombia, I think, and sitting in Chile, where, you know, a lot of the projects have become viable because of those long-term agreements that you mentioned with the mining companies, and which have been very successful here. I think that's an area that is very interesting, that combines both lower cost solutions for the mining industry, decarbonization opportunities for the mining industry, and decarbonization opportunities for the countries in achieving its Paris goals. So I think that, you know, is another huge opportunity in the region.
No, I agree. And maybe I just realized it's 11:55, so we just have 5 minutes. I'm trying to make a habit of just speaking well for everyone, because maybe other people have calls afterwards and meetings probably. You mentioned CCSI, which is Columbia University in New York. That has worked of sustainability, of extractive industry, especially the legal aspect of it with Lisa Sachs. I mean, the idea here is, I think that there's a very interesting, umbrella, or at least network of expertise between, the German foreign policy services with GIZ, Columbia University, University of Miami. We have other, entities that are both academic but have a very large outreach with UN agencies. Obviously, CSI has it, being based in New York, so close to UNDP and UNEP. But there's this capacity to sometimes, provide successful, alliances between, different projects, show how it actually makes changes on the ground. But more importantly, often, that's, I keep repeating this, but the capacity from mining companies to communicate it to communities that are often antagonized. Whatever comes out of the mouth of a series of very good mining, executives that I know that are really dedicated to the territory is not considered, credible by communities because they represent the mining companies. And sometimes maybe being in alliance with GIZ, with Columbia University, CSI, with us at America's Market Intelligence, Africa Market Intelligence, or others, allows to bring panels of experts and showcase that these movements towards the sustainable development of the territory is actually part of a global best practice that is backed by United Nations, backed by a series of academic actors, backed by the German government's ideas of what should be sustainable development. And this is potentially the coloring that will help a lot of the projects that are sufficiently well designed at the mining companies, or could be improved also through a little bit of expertise, to actually meet their goal, to be understood by communities, and to break this lack of trust that often has been built by past executives or past companies that were operating the mine and others. And we'd be happy to, anyone that wants to reach out to Nicholas on this, or to us, or whoever, we'd be happy to be part of supporting some of your operation yourself. Let me just finish with one question from Raziel. For regional size mining projects with long life potential, perhaps the mining viewpoint with CSR appendix should be replaced by a holistic planning approach where value creation in other areas, agriculture, for example, should be given a platform. For example, Development Partner Institute as an inclusive long-term vision. I'm not familiar with Development Partner Institute as per se. I don't know if you are, Nicholas. I'll look into it. But how does GIZ, for example, or other organizations can help move away from just basic CSR, is often considered just marketing, to something, which would be a holistic vision of the dedication of the company here for 10, 15 years to develop the territory?
Yeah, I would say that the process of doing these things are just as important as whether they're good or bad, right? And that's how it is. If someone proposes a very good solution, but it's not done the right way, then it won't fly. So in regions where there is a lot of distrust towards the mining sector, rightly so or not rightly so, you need to find ways to ensure that that the message comes across. I think these partnerships can work, can help in that. I think you need to analyze in a bit more detail as to where the problem lies. So sometimes it's people from the capital coming to the region to telling the region what to do doesn't work. So there you might want to have a partner that's international. In other jurisdictions, you don't want an international because he's seen as the Western guy that always has told us what to do. So yeah, I think it's very, very project specific in terms of what partnerships you seek. But I think in almost all cases, it's better to work as a team with different entities, however they may look, and work in a transparent way with all actors than trying to do it alone in terms of process. And the transparent way in the long term will always, I think, provide more benefits than not. And on the last point, on the regional perspective, I think that's the way to go to look beyond mine-specific impacts, but to take a more holistic regional approach. And I would always promote that approach over, the only focusing on the area of the social and environmental impact assessment.
Perfect. And I agree with you. I'll just wrap up with two things. First of all, I was looking at the question. There was a series of criticism on Rio Tinto and their link with archaeological sites, especially in Australia. We personally never worked with Rio Tinto, but I know a series of actually good executives at Rio Tinto that sometimes are part of the coffee chats of the webinar. So I will, mention that to them, and if they want to be part of a future chat and discuss this, I mean, that could be a good way. So I'm here to relay some concerns and questions. The next coffee chat, however, is going to be also with Nicholas, but you're welcome to join as part of the attendance. We'll have Terry Hammond from the World Gold Council, so the CFO at the World Gold Council. I've been part of the initiative of launching the responsible gold mining principle with the World Gold Council, and it being officially launched. I think it was this week or next week, but he'll be with us on Tuesday at 11 a.m. to discuss the vision of the World Gold Council towards sustainable mining, and more than anything, where is the vision of the industry in the gold sector in terms of, I probably will bring questions of the rise of price of gold, the change at the World Gold Council, new chairman and others. So that'd be an interesting coffee chat. Until then, I'll just wish you a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Reach out to us by email if you have any questions. We're just trying to share best practices and engage with you guys. So feel free to use this space as your own also. Take care.